This week, I took a stroll down memory lane and gathered a few gems that I picked up along the way to share with you. Today, I am sharing some of the dumb things that I learned in church or from believers. Most of these are from sermons that I heard in the various churches that I have attended. A few are from small group leaders, and a couple are odds and ends sprinkled in. I hope you enjoy them. Hello and welcome. Today's trip down memory lane of dumb things that I've been taught by Christians is in no particular order. However, I did save the best one for last, so be sure to stick around for that one. Let's have a chat. Number 1, liquor is evil. I lived in a dry county in Texas in the early 80s. Our pastor, of a small Baptist church in Coppers Cove, Texas, had grown up with an alcoholic parent and was convinced that the problem wasn't the person, it was the alcohol. He went on rants in the church against liquor. There was a petition to the city council from a restaurant that wanted a license to sell liquor by the drink. This pastor went to the council session and made his voice heard. He made such an ass of himself that it made the local papers. Even as believers and teetotalers, my husband and I were so embarrassed by the pastor that we left the church. We met with the pastor to let him know why we were leaving. He told us that we would never find a Baptist church that didn't agree with him. We did. It took all of one try to find another Baptist church in the area where the pastor didn't take a stand on alcohol. At the time, I didn't drink at all. I did believe that drinking alcohol was displeasing to God, even if it wasn't evil. The pastor never got that it wasn't that we wanted to drink. We weren't looking for a church that would condone drinking. We just wanted a church where we wouldn't be embarrassed by a pastor ranting about how everyone outside of his church needed to behave as if they were church members. Number 2, you should bring your unchurched friends to church to be ridiculed for not coming to church. Now, the pastor didn't actually phrase it this way, but it is one of the reasons why I left that particular church. The pastor mentioned somewhere in almost every Sunday sermon about how everyone needs to be telling their unchurched friends and family about Jesus and bring them to church. In one service, he talked about how some people say that they can worship God from the golf course, so they don't need to come to church. He went on to ridicule anyone that doesn't go to church every Sunday. The intent of this, of course, was to appeal to his base, to make everyone in the church feel good about the fact that they were not out on the golf course or anywhere else they might want to be. Y'all are the good kids that God approves of. But later, in that same sermon, he gave his usual admonition that we all needed to be bringing our unchurched friends in. I was wondering how he didn't get how embarrassing it would be to bring an unbeliever there for him to ridicule for not being in church every Sunday. If this was a one-time thing, it wouldn't be so bad, but it happened enough that I concluded that I wouldn't even want to bring out-of-town believing family to see him. We were attending a satellite church that got a video feed from the main church, so I rarely saw the pastor in person. I talked about the situation with a friend who was on staff with the church and was one of the leaders of our Sunday evening life group. Life group is Sunday school for adults. It's a prayer and Bible study time in people's homes. She agreed with me, and she said she was also embarrassed to bring unbelievers to hear our pastor for fear that he would ridicule them. I asked why she stayed and even was on staff if she felt like that. She said it was because she really felt the Spirit telling her that God wanted her here. I was getting no such message from God. Time to find another church. 3. Eve had sex with her sons, Cain and Seth, to produce humanity because Adam had died. This didn't come from a pastor, but from the person who led me to Christ. I was an unbeliever when I heard this one, so I hadn't read any of the Bible yet, and I fell for it. As soon as I read a Bible, just a few months later, I realized that this was wrong, and it was a weird thing to say. But I never asked him about it. He was a new believer himself at the time. The real kicker is that I gave him a pass as a new believer who had not yet discovered the truth. What I should have done is realize that as he was sharing the gospel with me, he was making the stuff up as he went along. This is a major issue with believers. If someone gets a Bible passage wrong, we overlook it because they were trying to preach the gospel. They were trying to please God. They were trying to do the right thing. Yet if an unbeliever misquotes the Bible or gets something wrong, they just don't understand. They have presuppositions that prevent them from seeing the truth, or they are being dishonest. Atheists make this mistake too sometimes. We could all be both a bit more skeptical of our own people and a bit more charitable toward those who disagree with us. 4. Plastic credit cards are the mark of the beast. I heard this one as a new believer. I heard it from several different places, so I'm not sure who to attribute it to. For those of you too young to remember, credit cards used to be a metal plate very similar to an army dog tag. A retailer put the plate on a gizmo, that's the technical term for it, gizmo, and put a form on top of it that had 3 copies with carbon paper in between them. Carbon paper. Now that's something I haven't seen in about 40 years. Damn, I'm getting old. Carbon paper was something that we put between 2 sheets of paper so that when you write on the top page, the pressure caused the carbon on the back of the carbon paper to imprint on the next page. We used this because we didn't have copy machines yet. So the retailer would press or slide, depending on which type gizmo they had, over the card and the form, and there would be an imprint of all of the information on the card on all 3 copies of the form. Then the customer signed the top copy. The retailer gave you the bottom copy and kept the middle copy and sent the top copy to the credit card company. All that to say, when we switched from metal plate cards, which not a lot of people used, to plastic cards, which caught on right away, the Christians were afraid that this was the fulfillment of the prophecy in Revelation about how in the end times no one would be able to buy or sell unless they had the mark of the beast. There were rumors that MasterCard had already printed cards with the number series 666 on them, just waiting for the right time to send them out so everyone would have to have a 666 card. Any believer that got a card with 666 anywhere in the number was immediately afraid and wanted a new card. 40 years later, we are still waiting for our Mark of the Beast cards. Number 5, you were never a believer. This is the one I currently hear from many sources. They all love to quote 1 John 2:19. They went out from us, but they did not really belong to us. For if they had belonged to us, they would have remained with us. But their going showed that none of them belonged to us. As a believer, I used to think this too, that anyone who left the faith was never really a believer, because a real believer would be unable to leave. As Pastor Steve Brown is fond of saying, once you see truth, you can't unsee it. However, what I didn't understand then was that just because you see something as truth doesn't mean you can't later find something that proves that what you thought was true was never really true in the first place. The problem with this argument is that it insists that the Bible is right, and thus all of reality must be made to fit the Bible. When the Bible is clearly wrong, you must deny reality to make the Bible be true. Thus, those that believe the Bible is inerrant must deny that I was ever a believer in order to make this verse be true. Since they cannot deny that I am real, to make the verse be true, they must either deny that I ever was a believer or deny that I don't believe now. My question to those who quote this to me is, what does it mean to believe something? According to the dictionary, believe means accept something as true, feel sure of the truth of. I most definitely did that. Is there a spiritual definition that differs? According to Nelson's Bible Dictionary, belief is to place one's trust in God's truth. A person who believes is one who takes God at His word and trusts in Him for salvation. I did that as well. Those who make this accusation then say that I believed, but I didn't really believe. How is this possible? They claim that I lied to myself, saying that I believed when I really didn't. But again, how is this possible? To lie is to say something you know is false. If I tell myself something I know to be false, then I don't believe it. Another possibility is that I spent 42 years lying to people, living as if I believed when really all along I never believed any of it. But why would anyone spend 42 years of their life trying to convince everyone that they believe something when they secretly do not? For what possible purpose? Christians are fond of saying that the disciples must have believed Jesus rose from the dead, as they died for this and no one would die for a lie. But I think living for a lie would be just as great a sacrifice. Would anyone actually believe that I lived as a believer for 42 years when all along I knew that I didn't really believe? Why? So I could have a YouTube channel one day and talk about how I fooled everyone? YouTube didn't even exist back then, so that theory doesn't work. If I believe that something is true and then change my mind when I realize I was wrong, it doesn't negate the fact that I did at one time believe it. I also have to wonder about how anyone is supposed to know who is a real believer and who is not. Some would argue it doesn't matter, that's between the person and God. But if one wants to fellowship with other believers, to read books by believers, to worship with other believers, one must have some criteria for determining what is a real believer. More importantly, if I can spend 42 years of my life believing that I am a believer, when all along I really am not, how can anyone know that they are a believer? Just because you know you think it is true? I most certainly did too. Number 6. Women can't be church leaders because if they were, the men would just let them do everything and they wouldn't get involved in church. This was from the pastor at an evangelical free church in Arlington, Texas. The pastor that said this is long gone. At the time, I believed this, as women always seemed more interested in spiritual matters than the men did. A different pastor confirmed this belief by asking, while trying to assess if there was enough interest in an area to start a church, how many believers were worshiping in that particular area, and was it just women, or were there some men there to lead? I find this a sad commentary on the spiritual lives of men in the church. If you can't lead, you won't do anything? It sounds more like a playground spat than a relationship with God. You won't participate unless you get all the positions of authority. If that's what you think, are you really a believer in God or a believer in power? Or is it a matter of being lazy? Did the pastor think most of the men in the church were just too lazy to get involved unless he dangled the carrot of getting to be in charge in front of them? I didn't leave this church over this one, but it should have got me to thinking about whether the men were really committed to this theology. Unfortunately, it didn't. Number 7. In vitro fertilization clinics don't kill embryos. This one came from a Sunday school teacher. He was teaching on the evils of abortion and was saying that all life beginning at conception must be protected. At the time, I was pro-life. However, I believed that life began at implantation. Without implantation, at least for now, it is impossible for a fertilized egg to grow into a human being. But more importantly, I felt it important to be consistent in my views. I had no problem with in vitro fertilization. But if one was going to claim life begins at conception, one had to be against in vitro as well as against abortion. When I pointed this out, the teacher's response was to dismiss me with the statement that he was sure in vitro clinics didn't kill embryos. According to the Center for Genetics and Society, in vitro clinics have destroyed 1.7 million human embryos between 1991 and 2012. The teacher's sister-in-law was about as right-wing as a person can get and was also in the class. She agreed with me, but for a different reason. She felt that in vitro clinics needed to be shut down as well because they kill embryos. And while I don't agree with her, I do applaud her consistency. When the teacher was told this from his sister-in-law, then he decided that he needed to look further into this. Of course, nothing more was ever said on the subject because, unlike the sister-in-law, most of the people in the church only really cared about stopping abortion, not protecting embryos. Number 8. Archaeology has never discovered anything that contradicts the Bible. This is from Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict, a book that was very influential in building my faith base early in my faith journey. I fell for this one big time. Whenever I had any doubt about the Bible, I thought back to this claim, which at the time I thought was fact. I would then set aside any doubt I might have, as I was certain that the Bible must be true, as no one had ever discovered anything to disprove it. About the same time as I read this, the claim was being made that Noah's Ark had been discovered on a mountain, which I also found exciting, as it seemed to further prove the truth of McDowell's claim. I never looked into the truth of McDowell's claim, as doing so without the advantage of the internet, that would not be accessible for another decade, was nearly impossible. If I went to the library to look this up, what would I look for? A book on discoveries that have not been made? A book on every archaeological discovery ever made, and then check each one against the Bible for a contradiction? You see why this claim was so easy to make, as fact-checking it was very difficult for anyone who wasn't an archaeologist. The falsity of this claim was also a primary mover in my deconversion. Just as this claim was the buttress of the foundation of my faith, when it crumbled, the foundation of my faith soon crumbled along with it. The real facepalm moment for me was when I heard Aaron Ra say that archaeology can prove that there never was a worldwide flood because civilizations that existed at the time of the alleged flood continue to exist without an extinction event. This was a facepalm moment because I knew immediately that he was right. I knew it because I had known it all along. I just hadn't put it together. I knew from history classes that civilizations existed before the time of the alleged flood. Never in any history class did I ever hear the professor say that suddenly the entire civilization just vanished, or suddenly everyone died in a flood. If archaeology, which is the foundation for what I was learning about in ancient history, really never contradicted the Bible, then we should learn about a global flood in any course in ancient civilizations. But we don't. Why not? Because the only evidence of any global flood comes exclusively from the Bible. Not only does archaeology not confirm a global flood, but every archaeological discovery of the civilizations of the 24th century BCE contradict the Bible. This claim also didn't cause me to leave a church, but this is the falsehood that led me to leaving the faith. Number 9. People who die don't need to live. This one came about when the plight of the people of Somalia was in the news. As we saw people starving by the tens of thousands, I wondered why God didn't do more to help. In church, our pastor was preaching on God's grace is sufficient for you. And the message was, if you pray for something and you don't get it, you didn't need it. If you want money, pray for it. But if you don't get it, the message is God's grace is all you need. You don't need money. If you desperately want a child, if you pray but don't get a child, you don't need a child. God's grace will sustain you and is all that you need. I did believe that. It's part of the reason that I kept lowering the bar for my expectations in life. Why strive for anything that God is saying no to? You should be content in whatever your situation is, because that is the situation that God wants for you. But I was bothered by people who pray not to die, but they die anyway, especially the thousands that were starving. I asked about this, and I was told that God's grace is sufficient for these people in death. They don't need to live. Talk about a cold, hard faith. I didn't leave the church for this one, but I did refuse to believe that some people don't need life. But I accepted that this was something I just didn't understand. It was one item on a long list of questions that I would have for God when we finally met face to face. Number 10. Ready for this one? Drum roll, please. The dumbest thing I have ever heard preached: women are saved from worthlessness through childbirth. This came from a sermon on the interpretation of 1 Timothy 2:15. To give it some context, I'll read 12 through 15. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing, if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. So how are women saved through childbirth? If this is the way of salvation for women, then Jesus didn't die for them. So clearly, this can't be what it means, because the Bible never contradicts itself, and the Bible is always right, so there must be a way to reconcile this verse with the rest of the Bible. My pastor came up with about 5 options of what this could mean. The only one I remember is the one that he said he believed was the correct one, that women are saved from worthlessness through childbirth. Yes, women, you are worthless until you bear a child. And then once you bear a child, you are no longer a worthless human being. Rejoice, for God has made a way that you do not need to forever bear the shame of your worthlessness. First question, are only women worthless, or are men worthless too? If so, did God not give men a way to be saved from worthlessness? Knowing this pastor, he didn't think men were worthless. He made that abundantly clear in other sermons. So much so that I asked a couple of the elders' wives about how he tended to ignore women in most of his sermons. One of them told me that when it comes to women, she just ignores him. This was a very small church. There were only about 40 of us. But one of the women could not have children. I asked the pastor over to talk about this sermon, and I asked if he was saying that this woman was worthless. He backpedaled and admitted that worthless was probably a poor choice of words, but he didn't back down from the sentiment of the sermon. In writing this script, I looked up this pastor, and from what little I found about him, he is still in the same location in Texas, although the church became a ministry for military service members. But he hasn't changed a bit. Here is his current ministry. I've blotted out the location to protect his privacy, even though this is from a public website. Men of Honor Ministry. God is answering your prayers regarding restoring Protestant men of the chapel at location. The Garrison Chapel has given permission to use our local Cadence ministry, Men of Honor, started in 1996, to combine with the Protestant Men of the Chapel. The overall purpose is men seeking a vital relationship with God and other men, with the goal to love God and others as ourselves. We are developing a leadership team to further explore ways to reach active duty men, location deleted, and retirees regardless of their marital status. Also, the long-range goal is to see these men disciple, mentor other men. When we disciple, mentor men, whether single or married, we and you, the support team member, are used by God to strengthen and save marriages and reach the next generation for Christ. He's still the same. Only men matter. Women service members are ignored completely. Yes, they are worthless unless they bear children. The only mention of women, other than in the family news section, is a reference to his wife, where he says, Air Force Ministry Outreach, name of wife, continues to prepare great airman dorm suppers for these wonderful airmen. Even the food is only for the men. His wife did bear him children, yet the only value he expresses finding in her is she can cook for men. Who is really the worthless one here? I hate for us to finish on such a disgusting note. Instead, let us internalize these thoughts. Every woman is worthy of love and acceptance, whether she bears a child or not. We should never ignore our own needs and the needs of others, saying, be content with what you have as it is what God gave you. Instead, give freely of what you can when you can, and take when you have needs. You don't need a God's approval, because regardless of sex, gender, race, or beliefs, every person is a worthwhile person. Live your life.